Hello. So today I want to talk about Climate Action Reserve's Mexican Forest Protocol. And this is the first time I've made a video about a protocol in particular. One disclaimer that I feel I have to make here is that I am picking on the Mexican Forest Protocol because it's easy to pick on. I have not made a video about, Vera's avoided deforestation, their VM007 or VM15, or American Carbon Registry's voluntary IFM protocols. And I probably won't, because those protocols are so bad that it would take me ages to go through them all. And in fact, Vera really doesn't even have protocols. They have buffet tables. If you're doing a Vera project, you just get to pick and choose, from this buffet table exactly what you want to do with your project. And so I think it's actually rather pointless to review a Vera protocol because I don't even think that they constitute a real set of rules. So that means, unfortunately for the Climate Action Reserve, that my ire is going to be drawn upon them. Let's talk about the Climate Action Reserve's Mexico Forest Protocol. This is an improved forest management protocol that takes place in Mexico, obviously. And the way that it works is that you're basically only credited for removals. And so, if you have a project area in Mexico, your baseline is basically the starting value of the project. And all the credits that are being earned are just what the forest can sequester as it grows. This is great, right? This is what everybody wants. They just want removal credits. They think they're safer. Unfortunately, this has not really been the case for the CAR Mexican Protocol. There are some major flaws in this approach. I guess one of the things that I want to point out first is that because this baseline is static, because it just starts at whatever the forest, started at in the project area, it's not going to account for forests that would have grown back anyway. And that is really important because there's a real solid chance with a lot of these projects that these forests were always going to grow back. If that carbon was always going to be removed from the atmosphere, then the project should not be getting credits for it. You can't go and pollute and then point to, a carbon project of a forest that was always going to grow back, because that carbon was always, that's already part of the equation. It's already factored in. You're not getting a new offset for that. So this is the problem with a lot of these IFM Mexico projects. One example of this is that, a lot of these areas were degraded or clear-cut very heavily in the 70s and 80s, and they've been kind of growing back ever since. If that grow back was always going to, continue to take place, people should not be receiving credits for it. Another bigger issue that I've seen with a couple of projects, now only one or two, is that if you cut down all your trees and then enroll your area for carbon credits, you essentially get all of the carbon that grows back on that land. That is not good. No matter what, if you go and clear cut a forest, it's going to grow back in some capacity, right? Like, this is how timber production works. They cut the trees grow back, they cut them again. And so that's not good at all. Aside from that, the bigger issue that the majority of bad projects on this protocol face is that there was clearly never any intention to cut these trees to begin with. And that's really bad. This is the classic problem with all IFM projects. How do you prove that these people were always going to cut their trees? Once again, if somebody wasn't going to cut their trees, if the trees were not at risk, then that carbon was always going to be sequestered. It was always going to be removed from the atmosphere, and you have not created a genuinely new offset. You haven't done anything to, whether or not the project exists, that carbon was always going to be removed. So you can't go and sell that offset to make up for pollution then. So let me give you an example of this. A lot of the Mexican protocol projects are little ejidos. They're basically these little indigenous communities that are basically preserving their indigenous land. I did a quick survey of over 30 projects using the Mexican Forest Protocol, and of the 30, 11 of them are taking place on land that has no history of forest harvest, going back to 1984. If you haven't harvested your forest in the last 40 years, then you weren't going to harvest your forest going forward. You were always intending on conserving this forest. And so I will say right now, we can rule out a third of the projects on the Mexican CAR protocol's standard as being not additional. Those are not valid offsets. I would say another problem is that, some of these groups, some of these ejidos have been, very lightly managing their forests. And it's not clear that they're managing them more than growth. It seems as if they may be letting the forest grow back and maybe just taking a couple of trees off of them. And so again, like they should have a positive baseline. The baseline on these projects should go up because the forest itself is sequestering carbon. And they should only be getting credits for even more growth if they're somehow able to manage to get the forest to grow even more than it would have. And so that is the biggest problem with projects on the Mexican Protocol. Like I said, about a third of them are just not any good, not valid because of that. They're taking place on basically land that's already conserved. And then some other larger portion is also, taking place on land that was probably never at risk, was probably always going to sequester that carbon. I have personally talked to some of the community members, some of the members of the ejidos that are running these projects, and I know people who have talked to them. And sometimes what we've come across is that these community members aren't even aware that they're supposed to be changing their forest management. They're not even aware that the whole purpose of this project is for them to change their forest management to sequester more carbon. They're just doing what they were always doing, and they're getting credits for it. So how does this protocol actually manage additionality? Well, it does. It basically tries to break it down into two components. The first is a legal component. So what areas were mandated by law to basically be conserved? And then the second component is like a performance standard, which basically boils down to were they allowed to cut these trees? Under the current Mexican forest management criteria, could these trees have been cut down? Which sounds a lot like the first standard to me. I don't put any stock in this. I put stock in actual data. I put stock in what these people have done in the past. If they haven't touched their trees for 40 years, if their trees are way beyond biological rotation age, then they're already conserving their forests. And there's no forest management scheme in Mexico, maybe in the whole world, but in Mexico that involves you just walking away from your forest for 40 years. These are lands that are not a part of the commercial timber rotation. And if they haven't been part of commercial timber rotation for the last 40 years, then odds are good that they're not going to be in the future. And so this is why we have a problem here, because this standard is not sufficient to weed out people who have been conserving their forest for decades. I would say, another problem is that a good IFM protocol should give you credits for avoided emissions. And I would argue that this is the case because in these projects, in the 50% of CAR Mexican projects that are good, that are taking place on land that was heavily degraded in the past, we should be giving credits to these people for preventing, deforestation that they could have done. And one of the reasons that is critical is because that is an important financial incentive for enrolling your forest if you're a timber company. If you're somebody who is literally deciding whether or not to cut down your trees or enroll them for forest carbon credits, if you can only get credits for the growth, you can't get credits for what you were intending to cut down, that's never going to be financially worthwhile for you. And so what's the implication? The implication is we've got people basically enrolling forests that, it looked as if they were kind of already had some sort of conservation in mind. Because there's no financial incentive for a timber company to enroll for offsets under this because they can't get avoided emissions credits, the only people enrolling are people who were already kind of conserving their forests. I do want to point out again that I would say probably half the projects on this protocol are pretty good. They do have a history of intense deforestation, and it does seem as if something good is happening here. 50% is a pretty good number for a forest carbon protocol. I'm sorry that I have to say this, but if you're looking at statistics here, more than 50% of Vera projects are just awful, and more than 50% of voluntary American Carbon Registry projects are just awful. And so, we may have a protocol here that has some flaws, but it is on average producing more good projects than the other protocols out there. Another good thing to say about this protocol is that it is the most open in terms of data. So every single project comes with a public database that shows exactly what its data is, what its findings are, and where its numbers come from. And this is so refreshing to see because I'm no longer just like trusting some verifier's numbers. Now I can actually trace back and see exactly how they went from measuring the trees to assessing exactly like how much growth was going to take place in the forest. So that is very refreshing. I guess the other problem that I would say that sometimes crops up with projects in this protocol, which it isn't necessarily constrained to this protocol, is that fire is a risk in Mexico, right? Wildfire in lots of Mexico, in parts of Mexico, is a real hazard. But it seems, as is often the case, that the projects that have really almost no fire risk at all are taking a pretty heavy hit, and the projects that have really high fire risk are probably not taking enough of a hit. And in fact, I would say that there are some projects taking place under this protocol that just shouldn't exist at all. I'm of the opinion that there are some forest ecosystems that should just not be used for carbon. You'll never find anybody else saying that, but I mean, the fact is, some of these projects really seem to me to be timber boxes that are inaccessible, and there's not any real firefighting capabilities near them. So that's another problem. What's the takeaway here? The protocol is better than average. It really is. I mean, I have highlighted some major flaws today, but it produces on average better credits, probably because it's more conservative and kind of only issues avoided emissions. But at the same time, there are these issues. Another big takeaway is that, you do still have to do your research on your projects. You have to make sure that you're picking a project that's additional, that's, really at risk, that isn't just taking place on land that was clear-cut 5 years ago. These are all things that you need to consider when you're buying projects from this protocol. All right, so that's that one. I apologize to Climate Action Reserve. You don't deserve to be the blunt of my ire here. You put out one of the better protocols on the market, and I immediately tear it apart. I wish I had the patience and fortitude to sit and go through one of Vera's protocols, but I'm not going to do it right now. I have better things to do with my life.